The Chicken Jockey, the surprising star of the Minecraft movie that looks very different to its Minecraft counterpart. Not unrecognizable, of course, but different enough that the other day I was looking at it and I just thought, you know what? I should build this. And that's exactly what I did. Here's how I did it. I decided to work on the chicken to start. The very first thing I do for a lot of my builds is I try and get the shape down first. The reason for this is that when you're building, if the shape is wrong, then everything else is going to look off. It does not matter what you do. It doesn't matter the type of build that you're doing, it doesn't matter if it's a house, if it's a person, if it's a chicken jockey. If the shape is wrong, everything else is wrong. Once I have that, I start work on the eyes. To get the chicken's eyes, what I do is I take orange stained glass panes and red sandstone slabs with white stained glass over them, and I use that to surround the area where I want the eye to go before filling it in with a brown gradient, and then I make the pupils out of black stone slabs and black stained glass panes. For the highlights, I just go ahead and I use debugged lightning rods. If you aren't really used to building in creative mode, you can use this thing called a debug stick to get different block states for the blocks in Minecraft, and one of those that has a cool one is the lightning rod. So the debugged lightning rods, you can have them so that way they're in their powered state, which makes them basically just pure white. Moving on to the beak, I made that a bright yellow concrete color, and I'm using resin to make the shadows on it. Now, in order to make this kind of blend a bit better, I'm putting orange stained glass over it, and I'm using, for shaping, a bunch of resin slabs with yellow stained glass over it. This is something you're going to be seeing a lot of from me. So I really like to use stained glass to get whatever precise color I want, and for this build I used it a bunch. Now moving on to some of the feathers on the chicken jockey. If you look at the pictures from the movie, you'll see that there are like a bunch of little tiny feathers off on the side of the chicken jockey's head, and I wanted to try and recreate those in Minecraft. So in order to do that, I used a bunch of pale oak blocks and quartz and all sorts of white blocks to just make some brighter feathers along this shaded part of the chicken. And then from there I used some glass and some slabs to make a quick gradient that shows sort of a highlight on the chicken's beak before going in and using lightning rods to show the line where both halves of the chicken's beak would meet. From there I do just a little bit of light shading on the chicken itself. I do this with bone blocks, with pale oak, with quartz, with lightning rods in some cases, and it really just makes it so that way the chicken looks a bit more lifelike. And then I add just a few extra details, like with the fences, so that way it feels a bit more textured than just plain Minecraft blocks would, which will help it look a bit more accurate to the Minecraft movie, which I think is quite nice. Now I move on to the wattle. The wattle is kind of the red part that's hanging down from the chicken's beak, and in order to make this, I start off by placing down some red blocks, and then I use some red glass and powered redstone wires. This is a very fun thing that you can do with World Edit, by the way, just to add a little bit more texture. And I set them at different power levels, so that way they'll have different amounts of saturation and brightness in the actual wire themselves. The ones at power level 15 are very, very bright red. In fact, they're too bright for this, but then the ones at power level 0 are too dark. So it's all about finding the right color in the middle. Once I've got that stuff down, the next thing that I do is I go ahead and I start to work on getting the wings shaded, so that way it's a bit more clear that they have highlights and shadows than just being flat blocks of diorite. Now, I could probably do this with a bunch of different Minecraft blocks, but let's be honest, that's kind of boring. So I'm just going to go ahead and use a bunch of glass. So now I'm just going to go ahead and continue to bring out the shape of this chicken's wing on this side, so that way I can shade it and then call it quits on the wing. Just a note on glass shading here, by the way, the more glass that you layer, the more that the color of the block behind it will change. So, for instance, if I've got diorite on one part and then I put green stained glass and then I put another layer of green stained glass ahead of that, that will be more green than just diorite with one thing of green stained glass. So I'm using that throughout this build so that way I can create gradients and shade without really using more than just one or two colors of stained glass and without that many background solid blocks. It's kind of cool. Part of the reason that I added that note right then though is because I am starting on the jockey part of the chicken jockey. And when you're working with a reference like the chicken jockey from the Minecraft movie, a lot of those colors don't really exist in game normally. So there's a way to work around that, and the way to work around that is with glass shading, like I just explained. Before I get to that though, I still have to lay out the shape for the chicken jockey, and I really struggled with this kind of, I'm not gonna lie, because it's got like some weird parts to it that are more rounded than others, and then other parts that are definitely diagonal. But after a whole lot of trial and error and even more trusting the process, I was able to finally get a shape on the chicken jockey that I was reasonably happy with. So I used this lime terracotta here to outline the areas where I'm going to want to have the edges of its blocky little head going, and where I'm going to have the details for like their cheeks and all of that fit in. And then from there I can start to lay out other details on its face like eyes, hair, mouth, nose, all of that. And I'm doing a lot of that in Blackstone just because it's pretty close to the color of the hair, eyes, nose, and all that in the Minecraft movie too. So for this, I'm going to be using different amounts of black stained glass and white stained glass, gray stained glass, brown stained glass, and I'm going to be using different amounts of green stained glass layered over that or under it to make it so that way each section of the zombie will have a different shade to it. So in areas where I'm going to be using more warmer colors, I'm going to focus more on brown and in some spaces even a bit of orange. But in areas where the color's a bit cooler, I'm going to be using more grays and all of that. So that way, in the end, I will have a lot of different colors to try and best mimic the particular skin tone of the chicken jockey. So, the other thing that I'm going to do here is I just want to explain a bit of why I'm shading things in the way that I am. So, if you look on the left side, that's where I'm putting a lot of the light, and that's why I've got a lot more of the white stained glass as opposed to gray or black stained glass on that section of it. And it's also why I'm using orange instead of brown over there. And this is just because in the reference that I'm using, that's where the light's coming from, so it hits that side of the chicken jockey's face, and then that causes that side to be brighter in the picture. Most of how I went and did this was I thought of that picture specifically just as different colors, and you just break it down into sections that are all one color. Build those sections in roughly the same shape and in the same spot, and you should be good if you just do that. At least that's how I tend to do it, and it makes my life a lot easier. So now I'm moving on to the actual face of the chicken jockey, and something that's kind of fun with this is to get the wrinkles on its forehead, I'm just alternating between dark and light colors at different intervals. And that makes it so that way it has kind of a wrinkly effect. I shade the arm pretty similarly to the rest of how I've shaded the zombie, although I do add some gray stained glass for a shadow under its hand, and I also use some different shaping blocks like stairs and trapdoors to better define the edges of its hand. From there, I'm able to move on to the shoes, which I shade again with just a bunch of stained glass layered over different blocks, in this case, brown terracotta, brown concrete, all of that, to get the correct colors. When I have that done, I go ahead and I start to use gray wool to outline the pant leg of the baby zombie. And for this one, I just use some deep slate to make like the rim of the pant leg, and then I use black stained glass to shade the pant leg darker as it gets closer to the chicken and further from the light. So at this point, there's really only one last big part to this project, and that's the hair. So what I'm going to do for the hair is I'm going to mix in some dark oak wood, which is covered in black stained glass, a bunch of other little glass colors, and also I'm going to go ahead and add little individual strands of hair hanging down on the baby zombie's face. This is mostly just to try and get the hair, which has up until this point looked pretty flat, to a level where it's got a similar amount of texture as the rest of the build. After that, it's time for the finishing touches, like going and adding more highlights to the zombie's eyes and wrapping up some of the shading on its arm. Now that that's done, we can step back and look at our glorious work of art. There it is, everyone. The chicken jockey. Well, everyone, that is it for today. I know that that wasn't a block-by-block tutorial, but I honestly just wanted to explain all of the techniques and stuff that I used for it as best as I can, so that way if you want to try something similar, you can. As always, thank you to my patrons. Your support truly does mean the world to me, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.